Before there was a monster, before there was fear given a face and named, before stones spread from her gaze like a silent plague across the ambitions of men, there was a woman whose existence belonged entirely to the sacred order of the world, untouched by spectacle, untouched by judgment, untouched by mythic violence. This story does not begin in blood, nor in screams, nor in the triumphant footsteps of heroes approaching a destined kill. It begins in stillness, in salt air heavy with the breath of the sea, in temples that stood not as places of conquest, but as vessels of restraint, where power was preserved through discipline rather than domination. Medusa was born into a world that had not yet decided what to do with her, a world where beauty was not yet a provocation and divinity was not yet a sentence. She existed before she was interpreted, before her body became symbolic, before her name was sharpened into a warning, and it is only by returning to this untouched beginning that one can understand the scale of what was later done to her. Medusa was not exceptional in the way later generations would claim. She was exceptional in the way sacred things often are, quietly and without display. She belonged to a lineage that was old even by divine standards, children of the sea whose blood carried endurance rather than dominance, being shaped by the slow violence of tides rather than the explosive force of storms. Her world was one of rhythm and repetition, of ritual acts repeated not because they demanded meaning, but because meaning emerged from their continuity. She was raised not to rule, not to conquer, not to seduce fate, but to maintain a balance older than the gods who would later interfere with it. In her youth there was no prophecy circling her steps, no shadow of future terror clinging to her reflection. She moved through sacred halls as one moves through air, necessary but unnoticed, a living extension of the order she served rather than its focal point. Her beauty, which later storytellers would obsess over as though it were a crime in itself, was not fashioned for desire. It was not sharpened into a weapon, nor elevated into a divine challenge. It was the kind of beauty that emerges from harmony, from a body aligned with its purpose, from a life lived in accordance with vows that asked for devotion rather than submission. She was not admired as an object, she was respected as a presence. To look upon her was not to hunger, but to recognize the calm authority of something that did not need to announce itself. The myths that would later reduce her to a face, a gaze, a horror, forget that before any of this, her appearance carried no threat. It inspired no panic, no lust-driven violence, no divine jealousy. It simply existed as rivers exist, as stone exists, as the sea exists when no one is drowning in it. Medusa's role within the sacred order was defined by restraint. She belonged to a space governed by rules older than personal will, a domain where the self was deliberately diminished so that something greater could remain intact. The temple was not a refuge for her, it was a responsibility. Every step she took within its boundaries reinforced a cosmic agreement that power must be contained, that the divine must be approached with humility, that not everything beautiful or potent is meant to be possessed. She learned silence not as oppression, but as discipline. She learned stillness not as erasure, but as strength. Her life was not small, it was deliberately narrow, focused, owned to sustain something fragile and immense at the same time. In a world where gods often tore reality apart to assert themselves, Medusa represented the opposite principle, preservation through self-limitation. There is a profound violence in what later myths omit, and that violence begins here, in the refusal to acknowledge that Medusa once lived a life defined not by reaction, but by choice. She chose devotion, she chose order, she chose to exist within boundaries because those boundaries held the world together. Nothing in her early existence suggested that she would one day become a symbol of terror. Nothing in her conduct invited catastrophe. And this is the most unsettling truth of her origin, that the horror associated with her name did not grow from an inherent flaw, nor from a transgression, nor from an ambition that exceeded its station. It emerged from the collision between a contained existence and a divine system that would later refuse to honor its own laws. This first truth must be held firmly without compromise or reinterpretation. Before the curse, before the violation, before her body was rewritten into a warning, Medusa was not a problem to be solved. She was not a threat to be neutralized. She was not a lesson waiting to be taught. She was a necessary part of a fragile cosmic architecture, a living seal placed not to dominate chaos, but to keep it from spilling outward. And it is only by understanding how complete, how intact, how lawful her existence once was, that the later unraveling can be faced without distortion. Medusa's days before the curse were not marked by drama, but by duration. And it is precisely this endurance that later storytellers failed to comprehend. Her life unfolded slowly, as sacred lives often do, measured not in decisive moments, but in the accumulation of restraint. Time did not rush toward her, it settled around her. Seasons passed without significance, years layered themselves without demand, and the world beyond the temple walls remained distant, almost unreal. She did not experience herself as an individual destined for transformation, but as a function of continuity. One more vessel carrying forward a covenant whose origins were already half forgotten. In this way, her existence mirrored the deepest structures of myth itself, where stability is never loud, and survival depends not on triumph, but on repetition. Within the sacred space she inhabited, Medusa learned the discipline of being seen without being claimed. Pilgrims passed through the outer boundaries, offerings were laid, prayers were whispered, but the inner sanctum remained governed by rules that protected both the divine and the mortal from one another. She stood at that threshold, not as a gatekeeper armed with force, but as a reminder that proximity to power required humility. To exist so close to the divine without reaching for it was itself an act of resistance. Her presence affirmed a truth the gods themselves often violated, that not all power seeks expansion and not all beauty demands possession. This was not innocence in the fragile sense later poets would romanticize. It was discipline refined into identity. Her inner life, though largely erased by later mythic reduction, must not be imagined as empty. Silence does not imply absence of thought, nor does devotion negate complexity. Medusa understood the cost of the role she inhabited. She understood that to remain unremarkable was itself a form of labor, that anonymity could be as demanding as glory. The vows she lived under were not chains, but weights, deliberately chosen to anchor something larger than herself. She felt desire, curiosity, the pull of the wider world, but these impulses were not denied through fear. They were acknowledged and set aside, not because they were sinful, but because indulgence would fracture the fragile equilibrium she served. This capacity to restrain oneself without coercion is one of the rarest forms of power in myth, and it is precisely why it is so often erased. There is a quiet cruelty in the way later narratives would reinterpret this restraint as naivete or fragility. Medusa was not protected because she was weak. She was protected because her role was essential. Sacred systems do not guard what is disposable. They shield what cannot be replaced. Her body, her presence, her uninterrupted devotion formed part of a larger mechanism that kept certain forces dormant, contained, unnamed. The temple did not sanctify her, she sanctified the space through her continued existence within it. This distinction matters because it reveals the truth that later violence would attempt to deny, that Medusa did not gain significance through suffering. She already possessed it. In the world she inhabited, the boundary between mortal and divine was not meant to be crossed casually. Myths often celebrate transgression as progress, but the older logic understood that some lines exist precisely because crossing them produces irreversible damage. Medusa's life before the curse was shaped by this understanding. She was not preparing for elevation, nor for punishment. She was maintaining a line that had been drawn long before her birth. That she did so successfully, quietly, and without reward is the reason her story must begin here, in this sustained equilibrium, rather than in the spectacle that would later define her. What makes this period of her existence so unsettling in retrospect is its completeness. There is no narrative tension here, no impending doom visible from within the moment itself. The world functioned as intended, the order held, the silence remained unbroken. And this is the most important condition to recognize before moving forward. Nothing was wrong. There was no imbalance demanding correction, no sin crying out for consequence, no flaw in Medusa's being that required divine intervention. The catastrophe that would later follow did not emerge from necessity. It arrived from intrusion. To understand who Medusa was before the curse is to confront an uncomfortable truth about mythic violence itself. Destruction does not always answer chaos. Sometimes it answers stability. Sometimes it targets what has endured too long, what has proven too resilient, too contained, too resistant to appropriation. Medusa's pre-cursed existence stands as evidence that order can exist without domination, that power can be present without spectacle, and that such configurations are often intolerable to systems built on assertion rather than preservation. And it is from this intact, disciplined, and deeply lawful life that the next movement of the story will rupture, not because it must, but because it can. There is a temptation when standing at the edge of what is about to come, to search backward for signs, to retrofit inevitability into a life that was never moving toward collapse. Resist that impulse. Medusa's final days before the curse were not marked by omens or fractures in the sacred order. The world did not tremble in anticipation. The gods did not gather in secret council. The sea did not withdraw, nor did the temple walls whisper of approaching violation. Everything that sustained her existence remained intact. And this is precisely why her story is so dangerous to systems that rely on moral causality. Nothing in her life demanded punishment. Nothing in her conduct invited correction. Her fate was not the consequence of imbalance, but the result of contact. Medusa existed at a point of tension that myth rarely allows to remain unresolved. She was a mortal woman entrusted with maintaining divine boundaries. This position alone placed her in quiet opposition to a cosmic hierarchy that favored domination over stewardship. She was not powerful in the way gods are powerful, but she embodied a form of authority that did not derive from violence or fear. Her authority came from continuity, from being there yesterday and the day before and the day before that, unchanged, unbroken, unclaimed. This kind of presence accumulates weight. It becomes immovable. And immovable things, in mythic systems governed by assertion, eventually attract force. It is crucial to understand that Medusa did not misinterpret her safety. She did not believe herself invulnerable. She understood risk, but she trusted structure. She trusted that vows mattered, that sacred spaces meant something, that the laws governing gods and mortals were more than ornamental. This trust was not foolishness. It was participation in a shared cosmology. To live within a system is to assume it will function as promised. When that promise fails, the failure belongs to the system, not to the one who believed in it. Medusa's tragedy, though not yet enacted, is already latent here, not in her choices, but in the fragility of the order she upheld. Her humanity, often erased in later retellings, was not defined by passivity. It was defined by endurance. She woke each day and resumed a role that demanded constancy rather than recognition. She existed without narrative escalation, without transformation, without reward. In mythic terms, this is a profoundly radical state. Myths are engines of change. They thrive on disruption. A figure who persists without altering the balance threatens the very mechanics of story. Medusa, before the curse, was not becoming anything. She already was, and what she was left no room for divine spectacle. As this chapter closes, it must do so without drama, because that is how her life existed. There is no final image of innocence to preserve, no farewell moment heavy with symbolic weight. There is only continuation. Another day within the sacred walls, another ritual completed, another affirmation of boundaries held. The stillness does not feel temporary. From within it, nothing suggests collapse. And that is the final truth of who Medusa was before the curse. A woman living inside a world that worked, sustaining an order that had not yet betrayed her. The violence that will follow does not correct a flaw introduced here. It interrupts a harmony that had no reason to end. And that is why this beginning matters. Not because it contrasts with the horror to come, but because it proves that horror was never required. Medusa's origin is not a prologue to monstrosity. It is a record of a life lived correctly in a universe that would later decide correctness was no longer sufficient. The violation does not arrive as chaos. It does not tear the world open with thunder or announce itself with prophecy fulfilled. It arrives quietly, almost politely, under the protection of assumptions that had never before been tested. This is the most dangerous form of rupture in myth, not the assault that shatters order in a single blow, but the one that slips through the cracks of trust, disguised as inevitability. Medusa does not wake on the day of her violation with fear in her chest or dread in her thoughts. The temple still stands, the vows still hold. The sacred laws that govern gods and mortals alike have not yet been declared optional. From within her world, everything remains intact. And that is why what follows is not merely an act of violence against a woman, but a catastrophic failure of the divine system itself. The sanctity of the space matters more than later tellings are willing to admit. This is not a violation that occurs at the edge of the world or in some lawless wilderness where rules have already dissolved. It happens at the center of restraint, within walls specifically designed to separate power from appetite. The temple exists to say no, to gods, to mortals, to desire, to force. It is a declaration made in stone that even divinity has limits. Medusa's role within this space is not incidental. She is not simply present. She is part of the mechanism that enforces this boundary. Her body is not an invitation, and her presence is not consent. She exists there because the system requires a human anchor, someone whose continued discipline affirms that the sacred order is real, binding, and mutually respected. The violation, when it comes, does not arrive as seduction or mutual transgression, no matter how later myths attempt to soften it. It arrives as imbalance asserting itself where it does not belong. Power crosses a line precisely because it can. The logic is brutally simple and terrifyingly divine. What is possible becomes permissible. There is no negotiation, no ritual collapse preceding the act. The sacred space is not destroyed first. It is ignored. And in that disregard lies the true violence. The assault is not only upon Medusa's body, but upon the very principle that the gods themselves are bound by the laws they impose. The temple does not fail her, the gods do. Medusa's experience in this moment is not framed by heroism or rebellion. She does not fight a god, because gods are not meant to be fought. She does not consent, because consent cannot exist where one will eclipses another entirely. What she experiences is the sudden, incomprehensible collapse of a world that had functioned without exception until now. The rules she lived by dissolve in real time, not because she misunderstood them, but because they are withdrawn without warning. This is the most devastating aspect of the violation, not the physical act alone, but the realization that the structure she upheld was never designed to protect her from those who authored it. When the act ends, nothing is restored. The silence that follows is not sacred, it is abandoned. The temple still stands, but it has been emptied of meaning. The vows remain spoken, but they no longer bind. Medusa survives the violation, but survival is not preservation. Something irreversible has occurred, not within her nature, but within the world's moral architecture. And it is here, in this aftermath, that the divine response begins. Not as justice, not as repair, but as containment of embarrassment. The gods do not ask what was broken, they ask what was exposed. The response does not come immediately, because divine systems rarely react to harm. They react to disruption of order as they define it. The presence of the violation stains the sacred space, not because Medusa is impure, but because the gods have revealed their own inability to govern themselves. This cannot be addressed by accountability, because accountability would require limitation. Instead, it must be reframed. The event must be reinterpreted in a way that preserves divine authority while relocating the burden of consequence. And so attention turns not toward the act, nor toward the one who committed it, but toward the one who remained afterward, breathing, visible and unerasable. Medusa does not plead, she does not accuse. Myth has no room for her testimony. What matters to the divine order is not what happened to her, but what her continued existence now represents. A reminder that sacred law failed in its most protected space. The gods cannot undo what was done. They cannot restore the temple to what it was. They cannot admit fault without destabilizing the hierarchy that sustains them. And so the response takes shape not as healing but as reassertion. Control must be demonstrated. The narrative must be sealed. The rupture must be contained. This is where the true crime of the divine response begins. Not in anger, but in calculation. Medusa becomes a problem not because she was violated, but because she proves that violation is possible. Her body, her presence, her survival threaten the myth of divine order more than the act itself ever could. And so the response will not ask how to protect her, but how to silence the implications of her existence. The gods move not to restore balance, but to redefine it in their favor. The divine response does not descend as revelation or thunder. It gathers slowly, like a storm assembling itself from fragments that refuse to name their own violence. What has occurred cannot be denied, yet it also cannot be confronted directly, because to confront it would require the gods to acknowledge a limit breached by one of their own. In mythic systems built on supremacy rather than accountability, this acknowledgement is impossible. The gods do not ask how a sacred boundary was crossed. They ask how the crossing can be absorbed into the existing order without altering its structure. The response, therefore, is not oriented toward justice. It is oriented toward preservation of authority, preservation of hierarchy, preservation of the illusion that divine law remains intact. Medusa, in the aftermath, is not treated as a wounded devotee or a violated guardian of sacred space. She is treated as evidence. Her presence becomes inconvenient. She stands as living proof that sanctity failed where it was meant to be absolute. The gods cannot erase the act itself, but they can redirect its meaning. This is where myth performs one of its most insidious operations: the translation of harm into narrative. What cannot be undone must be reframed. What cannot be punished must be displaced. Responsibility begins to drift, subtly at first, away from the perpetrator and toward the one whose continued existence threatens to expose the fracture. The temple, once a site of restraint, becomes a site of contamination, not because it has been defiled by Medusa, but because it now holds a memory the gods cannot tolerate. Sacred spaces in myth are not allowed to remember divine failure. Memory itself becomes a danger, and so the presence of Medusa within those walls is no longer interpreted as devotion, but as disruption. She does not speak, yet she accuses simply by remaining. Her silence is unbearable because it refuses to participate in the narrative adjustment the gods require. She does not claim blame. She does not transform her suffering into justification. She merely exists, and this existence resists reinterpretation. The divine response begins to take shape through language before it takes shape through action. Words shift, meanings are adjusted. What was once violation becomes offense. What was once harm becomes transgression. The grammar of power rearranges itself so that the weight of consequence slides downward, away from the divine and toward the mortal. This is not done through open decree, but through implication, through the subtle reordering of assumptions. Medusa's presence is no longer neutral. It is reclassified as dangerous, not because she has changed, but because the gods need something to point to when asked where the sanctity went. In this process, Medusa's former devotion is not denied, it is rendered irrelevant. Her years of restraint, her silence, her fidelity to sacred law do not enter the calculation. Mythic systems rarely account for history when authority is at stake. What matters is the present problem, a sacred space that now carries a contradiction. The gods must choose between acknowledging their own breach or asserting control elsewhere. The choice is immediate and absolute. Control will be reasserted not by limiting divine behavior, but by redefining the meaning of what has occurred. There is no counsel where Medusa is heard. There is no inquiry into her experience. Her body is not treated as a site of harm, but as a site of consequence. This distinction is essential. Harm demands repair. Consequence demands enforcement. The divine response selects the latter because enforcement reinforces hierarchy while repair threatens it. The gods are not indifferent, they are strategic. Their response is shaped by fear, not fear of Medusa, but fear of precedent. If violation within sacred boundaries is acknowledged without displacement, then divine authority becomes conditional. That cannot be allowed. And so the response advances toward inevitability, not with cruelty as its primary motive, but with order as its justification. The gods convince themselves that something must be done, not because Medusa deserves punishment, but because the world requires clarity. Ambiguity is intolerable to systems built on absolute power. The violation has introduced ambiguity. A god acted unlawfully, and a mortal survived within a space meant to be inviolable. One of these truths must be erased. It will not be the former. This chapter moves forward under this weight, toward an outcome not yet enacted, but already decided. Medusa remains suspended between what she was and what the gods are preparing to make of her. The violation has not ended with the act itself. It continues in the slow, deliberate withdrawal of protection, in the silent consensus forming above her, in the unspoken understanding that the cost of restoring divine order will be exacted from the only being who cannot resist it. The divine response, still unfolding, has not yet revealed its final form, but its direction is now clear. It will not heal, it will not confess. It will transform accountability into punishment and memory into threat. And Medusa, who once existed to preserve sacred boundaries, now stands at the center of a decision that will redefine her not by what was done to her, but by what the gods need her to become. The divine response reaches its most decisive phase not through spectacle, but through silence, formalized into law. What is about to be done is not announced to the world, because the world is not the audience. The gods do not need witnesses. They need resolution. Medusa remains where she has always been, within the boundaries she once upheld. But those boundaries no longer function as protection. They have become the perimeter of judgment. The sacred order she served now turns inward, not to examine its failure, but to excise its reminder. This is how divine systems survive contradiction. They do not repair what breaks, they isolate it. No acknowledgement is given that a crime occurred. To name the violation would be to concede that divine will is not synonymous with divine law. Instead, the event is dissolved into abstraction. Something improper happened, something must be corrected. The language is deliberately vague because vagueness preserves authority. Precision would require blame, and blame would require consequence for those who cannot be punished. Medusa, by contrast, can be acted upon. Her mortality makes her available. Her silence makes her manageable. The gods do not rage against her. They move around her, rearranging the moral geometry of the world so that she becomes the focal point of correction without ever being named as innocent or guilty. What makes this moment especially devastating is that it masquerades as order restored. From the divine perspective, the response is rational, even necessary. A sacred space has been compromised. A contradiction has entered the mythic record. To allow that contradiction to stand unresolved would invite further instability. The solution, therefore, must be decisive, symbolic, and irreversible, but it must also be displaced. The cause cannot be addressed, so the effect will be transformed into the solution. Medusa's existence after the violation becomes the justification for action. Her continued presence is framed as imbalance. Her unaltered state is treated as disorder. There is no hatred in this response, and that absence is crucial. Hatred would imply emotion, and emotion would imply responsibility. What unfolds instead is colder than cruelty. It is administration. It is the enforcement of a cosmic narrative that cannot tolerate loose ends. Medusa is not condemned because she is dangerous. She is made dangerous because condemnation requires an object. This distinction cannot be overstated. The gods are not responding to a threat. They are creating one retroactively so that the response appears proportionate. The tragedy of this moment lies in its final inversion of meaning. Medusa's former purity, her restraint, her unwavering adherence to sacred law are not erased. They are repurposed. They become the backdrop against which the divine order asserts that something has gone wrong, not with the gods, but with the world that allowed such an event to become visible. Her body, once a vessel of continuity, is now treated as a site of unresolved tension, not yet transformed, not yet altered, but already marked as the place where responsibility will be buried. This chapter must end here before the mechanism completes itself. Nothing overt has been done to Medusa yet. No curse has been spoken into being. No visible change has occurred, and yet everything is already lost. Protection has been withdrawn. Meaning has been reassigned. The divine order has chosen its path, and it does not include restoration. The violation has been absorbed into the structure of power, not as a crime to be addressed, but as a flaw to be managed. Medusa stands at the threshold between endurance and redefinition, not because she crossed a line, but because a line was erased behind her. The gods have decided that the world cannot remain as it was, and they have also decided who will pay for that change. This is the end of the violation as an event, and the beginning of consequence as policy. What comes next will not be framed as punishment for what happened, but as a necessary act to preserve order, and that is what makes it divine. The final movement of the divine response unfolds without ceremony, because ceremony would imply reverence, and reverence would require acknowledgement of what has been lost. Instead, the gods allow inevitability to do the work of justification. By the time the response reaches its conclusion, it no longer appears as a choice at all, but as the only remaining configuration that allows the mythic system to continue without contradiction. Medusa is no longer addressed as a devotee, nor even as a victim. She is addressed as a condition, a variable that must be stabilized, a presence whose meaning must be fixed, so that it no longer threatens the narrative coherence of divine order. What must be understood is that this response is not driven by vengeance. Vengeance would be personal, emotional, reactive. This is structural. The gods are not correcting a moral wrong. They are sealing a breach in authority. The violation revealed that sacred law could be broken by those who authored it. That truth cannot be allowed to circulate. It must be buried beneath a new interpretation in which the sacred space is restored, the hierarchy remains unquestioned, and the memory of divine failure is redirected away from its source. Medusa's existence, unchanged and uncontained, prevents this closure. As long as she remains as she was, the world remembers. The logic that solidifies now is chilling in its clarity. The gods conclude that the violation did not truly damage the sacred order. Rather, it exposed a weakness in the boundary between mortal and divine. That boundary, they decide, must be reinforced, not by limiting divine movement, but by redefining the mortal presence within it. The responsibility for restoring sanctity is subtly shifted. The burden of cosmic repair is placed upon the one who did not cause the rupture, but made it visible. This is how power preserves itself, by converting exposure into guilt and survival into liability. Medusa, still silent, still intact in body and mind, becomes the focus of a divine anxiety that has nothing to do with her actions and everything to do with what she represents. She represents a contradiction the gods cannot afford to leave unresolved, that devotion did not protect her, and that sacred law did not restrain divine will. As long as she remains unaltered, this contradiction persists. The divine response, therefore, moves toward resolution not by addressing the past, but by reshaping the present in a way that controls the future interpretation of what occurred. This is the moment where the gods choose narrative over truth. They decide that the story must not be about violation, but about consequence. Not about broken law, but about restored order. And for that story to function, Medusa cannot remain what she was. Her identity must be altered so that the violation no longer reads as a failure of divine restraint, but as the prelude to a necessary correction. The gods do not yet act, but the intention is complete. The meaning of Medusa's existence has been reassigned without her consent, without her voice, without her transformation even having begun. The cruelty of this conclusion lies in its quietness. There is no lightning strike, no public decree, no visible condemnation. The divine response ends not with action, but with permission withdrawn. The protection that once surrounded Medusa dissolves. The sanctity that once defined her role is no longer extended to her. She is left standing in a space that still bears the name of sacredness, but no longer offers its shelter. This withdrawal is the final verdict. Everything that follows will proceed as though it were inevitable, even though it is entirely chosen. This chapter closes not with punishment enacted, but with the conditions for punishment fully prepared. The gods have absolved themselves without confession. They have preserved their authority without accountability. They have transformed a violation into a justification. Medusa remains alive, present, and unchanged, yet she now exists within a world that has already decided she cannot remain so. The divine response is complete when the system no longer sees her as someone to protect, but as something that must be resolved. What comes next will not be framed as cruelty. It will be framed as necessity. And that is the final, most devastating achievement of the divine response. It makes what is about to be done feel required, even though nothing in the world demanded it, except the gods' refusal to be bound by the laws they claim to uphold. The weaponization of Medusa's body does not begin with fire or spectacle, nor with a sudden eruption of visible monstrosity. It begins with reclassification. The gods do not first change what she is, they first change what she means. This distinction is essential because divine violence rarely operates through chaos. It operates through definition. Before flesh is altered, purpose is rewritten. Medusa's body, once a vessel of continuity and restraint, is quietly removed from the category of protected and placed into the category of useful. Not useful to her, useful to order, useful to fear, useful as a corrective symbol within a system that has already decided that her continued humanity is intolerable. This moment must be understood as an act of design, not reaction. The gods are not improvising, they are completing a process that began when protection was withdrawn and meaning was reassigned. The violation exposed a weakness in divine authority. The response prepared the conditions for control. Weaponization is the final solution because it achieves multiple objectives at once. It silences the memory of what occurred by replacing it with a new narrative. It transforms Medusa from witness to warning, and it ensures that no future boundary will be trusted again without fear standing behind it. The gods do not merely punish Medusa, they repurpose her. Her body becomes the site where divine failure is buried beneath function. The logic is merciless but precise. If Medusa can be made dangerous, then her presence retroactively justifies her removal from sacred space. If her gaze can destroy, then her earlier existence within the temple can be reframed as latent threat rather than proof of broken law. This is how myth edits its own history. The gods do not erase the past, they overwrite it. Medusa's body becomes the ink with which they rewrite the meaning of the violation. The transformation, when it begins, is not framed as cruelty, it is framed as correction. Divine power does not admit to harm, it claims necessity. What is done to Medusa is presented not as an act against her, but as an act for the world. Her body is re-engineered to carry consequence, to externalize fear, to embody the warning that sacred boundaries are enforced not by law, but by terror. She is no longer meant to preserve order through discipline. She is meant to preserve it through paralysis. This is the deepest inversion of her original role. Where once she held chaos at bay by remaining unchanged, she is now altered so that chaos recoils from her presence. The gods do not remove danger from the world, they concentrate it. They place it within her, so that the cost of divine transgression is never paid by the divine again. Medusa becomes the visible consequence of invisible crimes. Her body absorbs what the gods refuse to carry, the fallout of their own unrestrained power. It is critical to understand that this weaponization is not an accident of rage, it is deliberate architecture. Her gaze is not cursed because sight is sinful, nor because looking is inherently violent. It is weaponized because looking is relational. To see is to acknowledge. To meet another's eyes is to recognize presence. By turning her gaze into a force that annihilates, the gods sever Medusa from relational existence. She is made untouchable not only physically, but socially, cosmically. No one can encounter her without consequence. She is isolated by design. Her body, once neutral, becomes absolute. There is no spectrum anymore, no context, no mitigation. Anyone who looks is destroyed. Anyone who approaches risks obliteration. This absoluteness is intentional. It removes moral complexity. It ensures that fear replaces inquiry. No one will ask what happened to Medusa if approaching her means death. No one will question divine judgment if the result is so visibly lethal. Weaponization ensures silence far more effectively than erasure ever could. What is taken from Medusa in this process is not merely her former beauty, nor even her humanity, but her interpretability. She is no longer allowed to signify multiple truths. She is reduced to a single function: deterrence. The gods strip her of ambiguity because ambiguity invites reflection, and reflection invites blame. Her body is transformed into a conclusion so final that it resists questioning. In this way, the weaponization is not only physical, it is epistemological. It controls how knowledge itself can approach her. This chapter must be entered with full recognition of its brutality, not because it is loud, but because it is efficient. The gods succeed here in doing what they failed to do earlier. They regain narrative control. Medusa's body becomes the means by which divine authority reasserts itself without ever admitting fault. She is no longer a reminder of violation, she is recoded as its supposed answer. And yet beneath this imposed function, something remains unresolved. Weaponization can enforce silence, but it cannot generate consent. Medusa does not choose this role. Her body is claimed as infrastructure for a system that already betrayed her. She is turned into a living boundary, a walking prohibition, a perpetual act of enforcement. The gods have solved their problem. The world has gained a monster, and Medusa, stripped of voice and protection, becomes the place where divine order hides its shame behind terror. This is where the transformation truly begins, not as mythic spectacle, but as institutionalized violence written directly into flesh. Once the transformation is set in motion, the gods do not watch closely. They do not need to. Divine systems rarely linger over the consequences of their own decisions, especially when those consequences have been successfully relocated onto a single body. The weaponization of Medusa proceeds not as a moment, but as a process, gradual, thorough, and irreversible. Her body is not shattered and remade in an instant. It is recalibrated. Each alteration strips away another layer of relational existence, another avenue through which she might be encountered as a person rather than a function. This slowness is intentional. A sudden transformation might invite questions. A gradual one allows the world to adjust its expectations without resistance. Her isolation becomes structural. The space around her reorganizes itself in response to what she has been turned into. Animals do not approach. Humans do not linger. The environment itself begins to serve the god's purpose, not because it is commanded to, but because fear is a self-propagating force. Medusa does not need guards. She does not need chains. Her body enforces distance more effectively than any prison ever could. The gods have achieved containment without confinement, exile without movement. She is not banished from the world. The world is banished from her. This is one of the most insidious aspects of weaponization. It disguises abandonment as inevitability. Medusa is left alone not because she has been formally cast out, but because no one can survive proximity to her. Responsibility dissolves into circumstance. The gods can claim they did not isolate her. They merely allowed reality to behave according to the new rules they imposed. This is how power avoids guilt. It designs outcomes that appear natural, even when they are meticulously engineered. Within this isolation, Medusa's consciousness remains intact. This is crucial. She is not reduced to mindless force or animal instinct. She understands what has been done to her, even if she is not permitted to contest it. She becomes aware that her body no longer belongs to her as a site of agency, but to the divine order as a mechanism. Her gaze no longer communicates, it terminates. Her presence no longer invites interpretation, it imposes consequence. The world responds to her not with dialogue, but with avoidance. And in that avoidance, her humanity is further erased. The gods rely on this erasure. Weaponization requires that the subject cease to be perceived as a subject at all. Medusa must become a phenomenon, not a person, a danger, not a story. The more her body is feared, the less her history matters. Memory fades where survival is at stake. This is not a failure of mortals. It is the intended outcome. Fear is the most efficient form of censorship ever devised. It requires no decree, no enforcement, no repetition. One glance, one consequence, and the lesson is learned forever. What is particularly cruel is that the qualities once praised in Medusa, stillness, silence, restraint, now become tools of her containment. She does not rage against the world because rage would require an audience. She does not chase those who flee because pursuit would imply desire. She remains where she is, unmoving, enduring, exactly as she once did within the temple. The gods have taken her greatest strength and inverted its meaning. Endurance is no longer devotion. It is evidence of monstrosity. Stillness is no longer discipline. It is menace. This inversion allows the gods to complete their narrative revision. They can now claim that Medusa was always dangerous, that her transformation merely revealed what lay dormant. This lie depends entirely on the success of weaponization. As long as her body functions as a threat, the past can be rewritten to justify the present. Her former life becomes irrelevant, inaccessible, unprovable. The world no longer remembers a guardian of sacred law, it remembers an obstacle. And yet, beneath the imposed function, Medusa's suffering does not take the form the gods expect. She does not become chaos unleashed. She becomes something far more destabilizing, a fixed point of injustice. She does not move through the world spreading destruction. She remains, and the world bends away from her. The violence attributed to her is potential rather than chosen. It exists in what could happen, not in what she seeks to do. This distinction matters because it reveals the final hypocrisy of her weaponization. Medusa is punished not for actions taken, but for reactions imposed. This part of her transformation must be understood as the gods' greatest success and their deepest failure. They have created a perfect deterrent, a living boundary that enforces itself without supervision. But they have also created a being who embodies the truth they tried to bury. That divine order sustains itself not through justice, but through the strategic distribution of fear. Medusa's body now carries that truth silently, inexorably, wherever she exists. The weaponization continues, tightening its grip not through escalation, but through permanence. There will be no release from this role, no return to neutrality, no restoration of choice. Medusa has been locked into function, and the world has been trained to respond accordingly. What remains to be explored is not how effective this transformation is, but what it costs to her and to the mythic system that depends on her continued isolation to conceal its own original crime. By the time the weaponization of Medusa's body is complete, the transformation no longer appears as an event, but as a condition of the world itself. The gods do not need to revisit their decision. They do not issue reminders or reinforcements. The system now sustains itself. Medusa exists, and because she exists in this altered state, the narrative holds. Fear circulates without instruction. Distance enforces itself without command. The divine order appears restored, not because justice has been achieved, but because silence has been successfully installed. Medusa's body has become absolute law, and that is its final function. Where once sacred law required belief, discipline, and mutual restraint, it now requires only avoidance. No one must understand why Medusa is as she is. Understanding would invite questions. It is enough to know that approaching her means annihilation. In this way, her body replaces theology. It communicates a single message with perfect efficiency. Transgression will not be survived. The irony, unbearable and unacknowledged, is that this message is enforced by someone who never transgressed. This final stage of weaponization strips Medusa of even the possibility of redemption within the mythic system. Redemption requires acknowledgement of harm and the potential for restoration. Neither is available to her. To restore Medusa would be to expose the original violation and the calculated response that followed it. To acknowledge her suffering would be to admit that divine order is maintained through sacrifice rather than righteousness. The gods cannot afford either admission, And so Medusa must remain exactly as she is, indefinitely, not as punishment, but as policy. Her existence becomes a permanent state of suspension. She is alive, but not living, present, but unreachable, feared, but never confronted. This liminal condition is essential to the god's success. A dead witness can become a martyr. A living one, sealed into function, becomes infrastructure. Medusa is no longer part of the moral universe. She is part of its architecture. She holds the system together precisely by being excluded from it. The tragedy reaches its deepest register here, because Medusa's body continues to perform its function without malice. She does not choose violence. Violence radiates from her as an imposed property, not an intention. This distinction is erased by the world that fears her, but it remains intact within the logic of the transformation itself. Medusa is not a predator. She is a perimeter. She does not seek to destroy, she prevents approach. The world interprets this prevention as threat because threat is easier to narrate than injustice. As the myths crystallize around her, language follows function. She is no longer named as a woman, nor even as a victim. She is named as a danger, as something to be avoided, as something that exists outside the realm of moral consideration. This linguistic shift completes the weaponization. Once a being is no longer spoken of as a subject, anything done to them becomes permissible. Medusa's body enforces silence not only through fear, but through the elimination of words that might describe her truth. This chapter must end with the recognition that the gods have achieved exactly what they intended. The violation has been buried beneath a new reality. The divine response has been reframed as order restored, and Medusa has been transformed into a mechanism so effective that her suffering becomes invisible. The world now believes that she is what she has been made into, and belief is the final seal of power. Nothing in this transformation prepares the world for justice. It prepares it for obedience. Medusa stands as the embodiment of a cosmic lesson that was never meant to be learned consciously, that order is often built by converting victims into instruments, and that the most enduring systems of control are those that convince everyone, including the victim, that there was no other way. This is the end of the weaponization, not because the violence stops, but because it no longer needs to act. The gods have created a living boundary that will persist without intervention, and in doing so, they have ensured that the cost of divine failure will never return to them. It will remain eternally written into the body of Medusa, standing alone at the edge of a world that fears her without ever knowing why. Perseus enters this story not as salvation, but as function. He does not arrive driven by outrage, nor summoned by moral clarity, nor forged by some personal vendetta against the figure he is sent to destroy. He arrives because the divine system requires movement. The gods do not act directly when the consequences of their own designs must be finalized. They delegate. They select instruments. Perseus is not chosen because he is exceptional in virtue, but because he is sufficient in obedience. He is the mechanism by which inevitability acquires hands. This distinction must be established immediately and without compromise. Perseus is not positioned against Medusa as good against evil. That binary is a later invention, a narrative convenience imposed to make divine decisions feel righteous. In truth, Perseus and Medusa never exist on the same moral plane. Medusa has already been transformed into infrastructure, into living boundary that sustains divine order through fear and isolation. Perseus enters only after this transformation has been completed, when her existence has already been reframed as a problem requiring resolution. He is not correcting injustice, he is executing a conclusion. His origin, often told as heroic destiny, is better understood as eligibility. Perseus is born into a web of divine expectation, political necessity, and inherited obligation. His life is shaped not toward freedom, but toward availability. From the beginning, his value lies in his capacity to be used. He is young enough to be commanded, ambitious enough to comply, and distant enough from the original crime to carry out its final act without hesitation. This is not coincidence. Divine systems do not rely on the righteous, they rely on the pliable. The task assigned to Perseus is framed as impossible, and that framing is essential. An impossible task absolves those who assign it of responsibility. If Perseus fails, the world remains unchanged. If he succeeds, the gods claim necessity. Either outcome serves the system. Perseus is not offered choice in any meaningful sense. Refusal would mean annihilation, dishonor, or divine reprisal. Acceptance is praised as courage. This is how coercion masquerades as heroism. It is important to recognize that Perseus is not told the full truth. He is not informed of Medusa's history, her violation, or the calculated process by which she was turned into a living deterrent. He does not need to know. Knowledge would complicate obedience. What Perseus is given instead is a simplified narrative. A monster exists, and monsters must be removed. This reduction is not ignorance, it is design. The gods understand that moral complexity interferes with execution. Perseus's preparation further reveals his role. He is not taught to understand Medusa. He is taught to avoid her gaze, to negate her presence, to interact with her only indirectly. Tools are provided not for dialogue, but for insulation. Reflection replaces confrontation. Distance replaces encounter. The entire methodology ensures that Perseus will never have to acknowledge Medusa as a subject. He is trained not to see her, because seeing would destabilize the narrative that makes his task permissible. This is not bravery. It is procedural efficiency. Perseus is being shaped into an executor, someone whose success depends on not questioning the nature of the task. His courage is measured not by risk undertaken for justice, but by his willingness to carry out an act that has already been morally resolved by those above him. He does not challenge the order that created Medusa. He affirms it by acting within its constraints. What makes Perseus tragic rather than villainous is precisely this absence of agency. He is not driven by cruelty. He does not seek Medusa out of hatred or desire for dominance. He moves because the path has been laid, the tools placed, the reward promised. He is operating within a framework that defines obedience as virtue and completion as glory. In such a system, refusal would not be read as morality, but as failure. This chapter must therefore be entered with clarity. Perseus is not the counterforce to Medusa. He is the continuation of the same divine logic that first violated, then weaponized, and now seeks closure. He is the final motion of a mechanism already in progress. The gods do not descend to end what they began. They send someone else to do it, and then they name the result heroism. Perseus sets out not to restore balance, but to finalize a design that cannot be left incomplete. Medusa exists as an unresolved contradiction, a living embodiment of divine failure contained through fear. As long as she remains, the system must rely on continuous silence to maintain order. Perseus represents escalation. He is not sent because Medusa is too dangerous, but because her continued existence, even contained, still bears the memory of what was done to her. This is where Perseus's role becomes unmistakable. He is not meant to confront chaos, he is meant to erase a remainder. His journey does not oppose the gods' earlier actions, it completes them. And that is why he is celebrated, not because he saves the world, but because he allows the world to forget. This first movement ends here, before action overtakes intention. Perseus stands at the beginning of his path, equipped, instructed, and morally insulated. He has not yet encountered Medusa, he has not yet acted, but the outcome is already encoded into the structure of his mission. What follows will not be a clash of hero and monster, but the execution of divine necessity carried out by a man taught never to ask whose necessity it truly serves. Perseus's journey unfolds not as a test of character, but as a narrowing of possibility. With every step he takes toward Medusa, the world around him becomes more structured, more guided, more insulated from uncertainty. Divine assistance does not arrive as inspiration or moral insight. It arrives as logistics. Paths are clarified, dangers are rerouted, obstacles are neutralized before they can require judgment. The gods do not want Perseus to discover who Medusa is. They want him to reach her efficiently. This is how necessity operates. It removes variables until only execution remains. The gifts he receives are often framed as blessings, but in truth they are safeguards. Not for Perseus, but for the narrative. Each object placed in his hands exists to prevent encounter, reflection instead of sight, distance instead of proximity, speed instead of contemplation. Perseus is equipped not to face Medusa, but to avoid her as completely as possible while still completing the task. This is not mercy, it is design. The gods are ensuring that the final act will occur without rupture in perception, without the risk that Perseus might see something that destabilizes the justification of his mission. As he moves closer to her domain, the world grows quieter. Not because danger increases, but because dialogue disappears. There are no witnesses left who might complicate the story. No intermediaries who might speak of Medusa as she once was. Isolation is not only her condition, it becomes his environment as well. Perseus enters a space already emptied by fear, shaped by avoidance, curated by silence. The absence he encounters is not accidental. It is the result of the weaponization that came before him, a landscape sculpted to prepare him psychologically for what must be done. What Perseus experiences here is often mistaken for resolve. In reality, it is detachment. He is not struggling with doubt because doubt has been methodically removed from the equation. The gods have ensured that the only information available to him reinforces the necessity of his task. Medusa exists only as a danger in the abstract. Her history has been erased from the environment itself. Stones stand where voices might have been. Stillness replaces testimony. Perseus does not suppress empathy. He is never invited to feel it. This is where the myth most aggressively insists on calling him a hero. He advances where others cannot. He persists where fear has emptied the land. But this persistence is not the overcoming of terror. It is the inheritance of privilege. Perseus can move where others cannot because he has been authorized to do so. The rules that immobilize everyone else have been temporarily suspended for him, not because he is righteous, but because he is required. Divine necessity creates corridors through danger, and Perseus walks within one of them. It is essential to understand that Perseus does not perceive himself as an agent of cruelty. He believes he is restoring order. The language given to him frames the act as cleansing, as resolution, as service to the world. This belief is sincere. Perseus is not lying to himself. He has been educated into a worldview where obedience aligns seamlessly with virtue. In such a system, the most destructive acts can be carried out with a clear conscience, provided they are properly authorized. As Perseus approaches the culmination of his mission, his individuality begins to fade from the narrative. His thoughts are no longer recorded. His inner conflicts, if they exist at all, are irrelevant. He becomes an extension of divine intent, a moving endpoint toward which all preparation has been directed. This loss of interiority is not accidental. The more personal Perseus becomes, the more dangerous he is to the system. A fully human executor might hesitate, a functional one will not. There is a profound symmetry here that myth rarely acknowledges. Medusa was stripped of subjectivity and turned into function. Perseus, in a different way, undergoes the same process. He is not dehumanized through terror, but through purpose. His identity collapses into his task. He exists to complete it. Once completed, his meaning will be reassigned again, this time as triumph. But in this moment, as he draws near, he is neither villain nor hero. He is alignment. This chapter cannot be rushed toward confrontation. The importance lies not in the act that will occur, but in the conditions that make it feel unavoidable. Perseus does not choose this necessity. He inhabits it. He walks forward not because he has weighed alternatives, but because alternatives have been erased. The gods have succeeded in creating a situation where violence presents itself as the only coherent outcome, and so Perseus advances not toward Medusa as a person, but toward a role he must fulfill to preserve the coherence of the divine order. He carries with him the full weight of decisions made long before he was born, decisions that require a final motion to seal them into permanence. He does not know this. He does not need to. Divine necessity does not require understanding. It requires completion. This second movement ends with Perseus poised within the final corridor of inevitability, fully equipped, fully authorized, and fully removed from the moral origins of his task. The distance between him and Medusa is now measured not in space, but in narrative. One has been turned into a function through terror, the other through obedience. And the system that shaped them both waits only for the moment when necessity can finally declare itself fulfilled. The final movement of Perseus's role unfolds not as a crescendo of valor, but as the quiet sealing of a process that has been unfolding long before his feet ever touched this path. By the time he reaches the edge of action, the world around him has already decided what must happen. There is no suspense in the divine order, only timing. Perseus does not stand at a crossroads where multiple futures contend. He stands at a narrowing point where all other outcomes have been systematically removed. What remains is not choice, but alignment with a conclusion that has been prepared in advance. At this stage, Perseus no longer moves forward as an individual with a future beyond the task. His identity has collapsed entirely into function. He is not acting against Medusa, nor even for the gods in any conscious sense. He is acting on behalf of inevitability. The distinction matters because it reveals why the myth insists on praising him. To praise Perseus is to praise the system's ability to convert human motion into divine resolution. His success will prove that the order does not need to dirty its own hands. It can outsource finality. What Perseus confronts, without being allowed to fully perceive it, is not a monster but a remainder. Medusa's existence represents something unresolved in the divine narrative, a living outcome of divine failure that could not be erased through isolation alone. Her continued presence, even weaponized, still carries memory. Memory is dangerous. It does not need to speak to accuse. It simply has to remain. Perseus is sent to close that breach, to convert memory into silence, not by addressing its cause, but by removing its bearer. The tragedy is that Perseus believes he is acting in service of balance. He has been taught that the world requires this act to move forward. He does not see that what he is completing is not restoration, but erasure. Restoration would require returning to a state before the violation, before the weaponization, before the gods chose narrative over truth. Erasure requires only that the final witness be removed in a way that appears justified. Perseus provides that justification through action. In this final phase, Perseus's humanity is no longer relevant to the mythic logic at work. His fear, if it exists, is functional. His resolve, if present, is mechanical. He is praised not for compassion, but for efficiency. The divine order does not reward moral insight, it rewards completion. Perseus's name will endure not because he questioned the gods, but because he did not. His obedience will be reframed as courage. His compliance will be remembered as virtue. It is important to see that Perseus does not escape the system he serves. He survives it, but he is not free from it. Once the task is completed, his role will be rewritten again, this time as triumph. The narrative will expand around him, elevating him into legend, because legends distract from mechanisms. By celebrating the executor, the system ensures that attention never returns to the necessity that required execution in the first place. Perseus becomes the story, so the story never has to examine itself. This is the final irony of his role. Perseus is remembered as a hero precisely because he never confronts the moral weight of what he completes. His legacy depends on distance from Medusa's humanity, distance from divine accountability, distance from the origins of the violence he finalizes. He is praised for ending a threat that only existed because the gods needed one. In this way, his success confirms the system's design. Violence has been resolved without responsibility. This chapter ends not with celebration, but with closure imposed. Perseus has done what was required, not because it was just, but because it was necessary for the gods. The divine order remains intact. Its contradictions are buried. Its authority goes unchallenged. And Perseus, having fulfilled his role as executor, steps out of the mechanism, carrying with him a name that will be polished by time until nothing of its original function remains visible. What remains unspoken, and must remain so for the myth to function, is that Perseus was never meant to save the world. He was meant to allow it to forget. Medusa's power does not end when her life does. This alone should shatter the logic that has governed everything that came before. In most myths, death is closure. It is the moment where danger is neutralized, where chaos is resolved, where the system restores itself by removing the source of disruption. But Medusa does not obey this rule, because she was never merely a creature acting within the world. She was a condition imposed upon it. Her power persists not because something went wrong in her destruction, but because the logic that created her cannot be undone by killing her. Death removes agency. It does not remove function, and Medusa's function was never tied to her will. To understand why her head remains powerful, one must first abandon the idea that her power was ever biological, emotional, or personal. It was not rage that turned beings to stone. It was not intention. It was not even sight in the ordinary sense. Medusa's gaze was the final expression of a long process of abstraction. She had already been removed from the moral universe before her death. She had already been converted into an instrument of enforcement. When Perseus completes his task, he does not destroy a monster in the mythic sense. He interrupts a living mechanism. What remains afterward is not a remnant of life, but a perfectly preserved tool. The gods did not design Medusa to act. They designed her to operate. This distinction explains everything that follows. A being whose power depends on will, emotion, or consciousness ceases to function when those qualities are removed. A system, however, continues as long as its structure remains intact. Medusa's head retains power because it is no longer Medusa. It is the distilled core of what she was turned into, pure consequence without subjectivity. Her death completes the abstraction. The last trace of her humanity is severed, and what remains is power without a bearer. This is why her gaze does not weaken with death. On the contrary, it becomes more reliable. While she lived, her existence still carried ambiguity. She could look away, she could remain unseen, she could endure without acting. In death, those possibilities vanish. The head cannot choose restraint, it cannot soften, it cannot resist its own function. It becomes absolute. The gods have finally achieved what they attempted from the beginning, a force that enforces order without requiring a living subject who might complicate its meaning. Medusa's continued power after death exposes the truth that the myth has been trying to conceal, that the danger was never her, but what she was made to represent. Her gaze petrifies not because it is monstrous, but because it embodies the ultimate divine logic. Contact without consent, consequence without context, punishment without dialogue. To look upon her is to be stripped of motion, of becoming, of future. One is reduced to an object, frozen into a single state. This is not violence as destruction, it is violence as preservation. The victim remains intact, eternal and silenced. This is why stone is the result. Stone does not bleed. Stone does not decay. Stone does not speak. Those turned to stone by Medusa's gaze do not disappear. They are archived. They become monuments to the same principle that shaped her. That the greatest form of control is not annihilation, but immobilization. In this sense, Medusa's power after death is more refined than it ever was in life. It no longer even pretends to be reactive, it simply is. Her head, severed from body and voice, becomes the perfect symbol of divine violence made portable. It no longer occupies a space that must be avoided. It can be carried, displayed, deployed. The system that once relied on her isolation now possesses a condensed version of her function, freed from the inconvenience of her suffering. This is not an accident of myth. It is the logical culmination of everything that preceded it. The gods do not merely tolerate the persistence of her power, they rely on it. What must be understood here before the narrative moves further is that Medusa's death does not undo the injustice done to her. It perfects it. The removal of her body does not end her role. It stabilizes it. Her head remains powerful because power was never located in her life, her choices, or her supposed monstrosity. It was located in the decision to transform a person into a principle. Death cannot kill a principle. It can only remove the last trace of resistance to it. The persistence of Medusa's power after death forces the myth into a deeper, more uncomfortable register, because it reveals that her function was never dependent on her presence in the world as a living being. Once her head is severed, what remains is not a corpse in the ordinary sense, but an artifact, an object whose purpose is fully realized only after the person it once belonged to has been removed from the equation. This is the moment where myth abandons even the pretense of justice. The system does not merely survive Medusa, it extracts maximum utility from her destruction. The head's continued power demonstrates that Medusa was never meant to be understood as an individual threat, but as a transferable mechanism. While she lived, her danger was localized. It required distance, avoidance, exile. In death, that danger becomes mobile. It can be placed where it is needed. This mobility marks a profound escalation. What was once a boundary imposed through fear becomes a weapon that can be aimed. And yet, the myth insists on presenting this as an incidental outcome, as though the persistence of her power were an unfortunate curiosity rather than the logical endpoint of her instrumentalization. There is no mourning in the narrative at this stage, because mourning would imply loss. From the perspective of divine order, nothing has been lost. On the contrary, efficiency has increased. The living Medusa required containment, distance, and silence. The dead Medusa requires none of these. Her head no longer occupies space as a being who might remind the world of the violation that preceded her transformation. It occupies space only as function. The removal of her body removes the last possible site of empathy. The petrifying gaze, now detached from consciousness, reveals its true nature. It was never a punishment delivered by Medusa. It was an effect triggered by proximity. It does not discriminate. It does not respond. It does not judge. It enforces stasis indiscriminately. In this sense, Medusa's power after death becomes purer, closer to divine in its indifference. It reflects the gods more accurately than her living form ever could. They too act without dialogue, without explanation, without consent. The head becomes a mirror of divine authority, stripped of any remaining human trace. This explains why the power does not diminish. Diminishment would imply exhaustion or dependence on vitality. But this power is not fueled by life, it is fueled by structure. The same structure that allowed the violation to occur, the same structure that justified the weaponization of her body, now sustains the efficacy of her remains. The myth presents this as inevitability, but it is in fact continuity. The system continues to behave exactly as it always has, only now with greater efficiency. Those who encounter Medusa's head are not punished for aggression. They are punished for presence. They do not need to attack, threaten, or even intend harm. The gaze does not care. This reveals the final truth of its design. It enforces not morality, but control. The victims are not judged, they are immobilized. Their stories end not in destruction, but in suspension. Like Medusa herself, they are frozen into a single, unchanging state, removed from time, unable to act, unable to speak. The symbolism of this cannot be overstated. Medusa was turned into a being who could not be approached. After death, she becomes an object that cannot be approached. The logic is identical, only the form has changed. The myth wants this transformation to feel like closure, but in reality it is refinement. The gods have perfected their instrument. What once required an entire life of suffering to maintain now exists as a portable solution to disorder. It is here that the myth's moral center fully collapses. The death of Medusa is not the end of violence. It is the point at which violence becomes most efficient. The power that remains in her head does not serve justice, protection, or restoration. It serves certainty. It guarantees outcomes. It eliminates unpredictability. This is the true value of her continued potency. A living being is always unpredictable. An object is not. As this chapter deepens, it becomes clear that Medusa's power in death is not an anomaly to be explained away, but the final proof of what the gods were always attempting to achieve. Her humanity was a complication. Her suffering was an inconvenience. Her death solves both problems while preserving the utility of what she was made into. The myth does not mourn her because mourning would acknowledge that something irreplaceable was lost. Instead, it celebrates the persistence of her power because persistence is the only metric that matters to a system built on control. The head remains powerful because it is no longer a being that might resist interpretation. It is pure symbol, pure function, pure consequence. And in that purity, it reveals the full cost of divine necessity. Not only the destruction of a life, but the conversion of that life into a permanent instrument of fear that outlives the one who bore it. The final layer of this truth emerges when we understand that Medusa's head does not merely retain power after death. It finally exists in the form the divine system always required. While she lived, her body still resisted complete abstraction. Breath, memory, endurance, and suffering anchored her power to a human frame. Death removes those anchors. What remains is power without biography, authority without witness, consequence without complaint. This is not failure of mythic logic, it is its completion. A living Medusa could still be misinterpreted as a victim, still evoke questions about origins, still invite dangerous curiosity. A severed head cannot testify, it cannot contextualize, it cannot accuse, it performs without explanation. In this sense, Medusa's death is not the silencing of a monster, but the silencing of meaning itself. The power that remains is finally uncontaminated by story. It does not require belief. It does not rely on myth. It works. This is why the head becomes mythologically superior to the living Medusa. It has no vulnerability, no exhaustion, no will that might refuse its role. It cannot suffer further, but neither can it escape function. The gods have extracted what they needed and discarded the rest. What remains is the distilled essence of enforcement, a power that petrifies without intention, freezes without hatred, dominates without voice. It is divine authority rendered visible and portable. Those turned to stone by the head are not enemies. They are collateral confirmations. Each statue is proof that the system functions. Each frozen body validates the decision to preserve this power rather than extinguish it. The myth never asks whether these victims deserve their fate, because deserving is irrelevant. The gaze does not evaluate, it enforces. In this way, Medusa's head becomes the most honest expression of divine justice in the myth. Absolute, contextless, and irreversible. Stone, again, is the key. Stone is permanence mistaken for stability. It resists decay, but also resists change. Those petrified are not killed. They are removed from time. This mirrors Medusa's own fate. Her life was ended, but her role was eternalized. The head does to others what was done to her. It arrests becoming. It converts living trajectories into fixed outcomes. Violence becomes architecture. At this stage, the myth no longer pretends that Medusa's power exists for her sake or even for protection. It exists because the gods cannot allow a world in which their authority ends with death. Power must persist beyond bodies, beyond responsibility, beyond memory. Medusa's head proves that it can. It stands as evidence that divine decisions do not die with their victims. They calcify. They remain. This chapter must therefore end with a recognition that is deeply unsettling. Medusa's death does not resolve her story. It removes the last human element from it. What remains is not tragedy but utility, not injustice but efficiency. Her head remains powerful because it is no longer Medusa, and that is exactly what the system required. The next movement of the myth will not ask why this power exists, it will ask where it is placed, and that question will reveal that Medusa's story never truly belonged to her at all. The final truth of Medusa's power in death is not found in what the head does, but in what it permits the world to stop doing. Once her power is detached from her life, the divine system is no longer required to explain itself. There is no longer a woman whose suffering must be accounted for, no longer a living presence whose continued existence might provoke questions about origin, blame, or responsibility. The head replaces explanation with outcome. It does not argue. It demonstrates, and demonstration is the highest form of authority in mythic systems built on force rather than consent. At this stage, Medusa's power ceases to be interpreted as curse or consequence and becomes something far more revealing: precedent. The head proves that violence can be preserved without context, that injustice can be made durable, that a life can be ended while its imposed function continues indefinitely. This is not an accident of storytelling. It is the myth's most precise articulation of how divine order sustains itself across time. Power must outlive accountability, otherwise history would accumulate unresolved truths. Medusa's head ensures that history remains frozen. What remains especially disturbing is that the head no longer requires belief to operate. While Medusa lived, fear spread through rumor, story, and reputation. Her danger had to be spoken of, exaggerated, repeated. After death, none of that matters. The power no longer depends on myth to function, it becomes self-authenticating. One look is enough. The system no longer persuades, it enforces. This is the point at which myth crosses into something colder than religion, pure administration of consequence. In this sense, Medusa's head represents the triumph of abstraction over life. Everything that made her story morally legible, her devotion, her violation, her endurance, her silence, has been stripped away. What remains is power without narrative. And power without narrative is the most dangerous form of all, because it cannot be challenged through understanding. There is nothing to debate with an outcome. Stone does not argue. Stone does not testify. Stone simply exists as proof that something irreversible has already happened. The myth never allows the possibility that the head might lose its power, because that would suggest that injustice can decay. It cannot. It can only be repurposed. Medusa's head endures because it is no longer tied to time, emotion, or circumstance. It is fixed. Like the statues it creates, it has been removed from becoming. This permanence is not natural, it is enforced. And enforcement, once stabilized, is always mistaken for inevitability. Here the myth reaches its most honest moment, even as it refuses to acknowledge it. Medusa's power after death reveals that the gods never sought resolution. They sought containment that could not fail. A living being can resist, a dead object cannot. By allowing her power to persist, the divine order admits without words that the problem was never danger, but unpredictability. Medusa's humanity was unpredictable. Her head is not. This chapter must end with a recognition that unsettles any notion of heroic closure. Medusa's story does not culminate in her death. It culminates in her conversion into an eternal instrument. Her head remains powerful because Power was the only thing the system ever wanted from her. Everything else, her life, her suffering, her silence, was expendable. What follows in the myth will not ask whether this power should exist. That question has already been erased. It will ask how such power is managed, displayed, and controlled. And in that question lies the final proof that Medusa was never destroyed to end her threat, but to perfect it. Athena does not place Medusa's head upon her shield as a trophy. That interpretation belongs to later ages, desperate to soften what this act truly represents. Victory implies opposition resolved through merit, justice, or rightful dominance. None of these apply here. Athena's decision is not celebratory, nor is it personal, it is administrative. The head is not displayed to honor a conquest, but to manage a remainder. What she takes onto her shield is not an enemy defeated, but a force that cannot be allowed to exist uncontained. This distinction is essential because Athena is not a goddess of impulse. She is not driven by rage, jealousy, or spectacle. She is the embodiment of order that survives by calculation rather than excess. Where other gods act and leave consequences behind them, Athena intervenes where consequences have become unstable. By the time Medusa's head exists as a portable instrument of petrification, the divine system faces a new problem. The mechanism that once enforced silence through isolation has become mobile. Power without location is dangerous even to those who created it. And so Athena steps in, not as avenger, but as regulator. Athena understands something the other gods prefer not to articulate. Medusa's power is no longer merely effective, it is unbounded. While Medusa lived, her danger was fixed to a place, a body, a perimeter. After death, that power can circulate. It can be used without context. It can petrify without restraint. This is not order. This is escalation. And escalation threatens hierarchy. A force that can be wielded by anyone, anywhere, undermines the careful architecture of divine authority. Athena does not seek to erase this power because it cannot be erased without exposing everything that produced it. She seeks to hold it. The shield is not decoration, it is interface. Athena does not hide the head, nor does she brandish it recklessly. She places it where it can be seen, but not approached. The shield is both barrier and display, a surface designed to interpose while reflecting. This is not accidental symbolism. Athena positions Medusa's head at the precise point where force meets opposition, where confrontation is deflected rather than absorbed. The head is not unleashed, it is fixed, contained within a structure that limits how and when it can act. This act reveals Athena's true role in the mythic system. She is not correcting injustice, she is stabilizing fallout. The violation, the weaponization, the execution, and the persistence of power have all already occurred. Athena arrives not to reopen those chapters, but to prevent their consequences from spreading beyond control. She does not dispute the legitimacy of Medusa's transformation or death. She accepts them as fates accompli. What concerns her is management. How does one integrate an eternal, contextless weapon into an order that depends on precision? By mounting Medusa's head on her shield, Athena resolves multiple dangers at once. The power is no longer free-floating, is no longer accessible to mortals, it is no longer subject to improvisation, it becomes part of the divine apparatus, overseen by the one deity whose authority is rooted not in dominance, but in structure. This is not mercy toward Medusa, it is risk mitigation. Athena does not honor Medusa by carrying her, she neutralizes her unpredictability. Yet even in this act of containment, something deeply unsettling remains. Athena does not destroy the head, she preserves it. Preservation is not kindness, it is admission. By keeping Medusa's head intact and active, Athena acknowledges without words that the power it represents is indispensable. The system cannot function without it. The injustice that produced Medusa has now been converted into a permanent component of divine order. Athena does not question whether this should be so. She ensures only that it is controlled. This first movement of the final chapter must be understood as the moment where myth abandons all pretense of moral resolution. There is no redemption here, no balancing of scales, there is only consolidation. Athena takes what remains of Medusa not to celebrate triumph, but to prevent collapse. The shield does not proclaim victory, it announces containment. And in that announcement lies the final confirmation that Medusa's story was never about punishment or justice, but about how power absorbs the consequences of its own actions and calls that absorption wisdom. Athena's containment of Medusa's head is often misread as an act of dominance, but dominance is crude, and Athena's power has never been crude. Her authority operates through placement, limitation, and foresight. She does not wield Medusa's head as a weapon in the conventional sense. She does not unleash it indiscriminately. Instead, she fixes it into the architecture of her own presence, binding its power to her vigilance. This is the defining feature of containment. Power is not eliminated but subordinated to structure. Athena does not trust the world with Medusa's head. She barely trusts the gods, and so she assumes custody herself. This custody is not born from sympathy. Athena's relationship to Medusa is not one of reconciliation or regret. It is one of recognition. Athena understands exactly what Medusa has become because Athena understands systems. She sees clearly that Medusa's head is no longer a personal relic of suffering, but a stabilizing agent in a cosmos built on asymmetrical force. Left uncontained, it would destabilize hierarchies, invite misuse, and erode the careful separation between divine prerogative and mortal consequence. Athena does not intervene because Medusa deserves protection. She intervenes because the system requires insulation. The shield itself is critical to this logic. A shield is not an instrument of attack, it is an instrument of control. It absorbs, deflects, redirects. By placing Medusa's head upon her shield, Athena ensures that its power is activated only in moments of direct confrontation, and even then, mediated through her own positioning. The head does not act independently. It acts only when Athena presents it. This is containment at its most precise, not suppression but regulation. Medusa's power is now governed by strategy rather than proximity. This arrangement also allows Athena to resolve a deeper contradiction. The gods cannot destroy Medusa's power without acknowledging the injustice that created it. But they also cannot allow that power to circulate freely without undermining their own supremacy. Athena's solution avoids both problems. By integrating the head into her shield, she transforms it from a rogue consequence into an authorized component of divine order. What was once evidence of failure becomes proof of control. The system does not apologize for Medusa. It absorbs her, yet this absorption comes at a cost that Athena alone seems willing to bear. To carry Medusa's head is to carry the visible reminder of divine excess. Other gods avoid such reminders. Athena does not. She places the head where it cannot be ignored, but also where it cannot speak. The face is visible, but voiceless. The gaze is active but regulated. Athena allows Medusa to remain present only as function, never as narrative. In doing so, she prevents the myth from reopening wounds it cannot afford to explain. This is why Athena's act feels colder than cruelty. Cruelty would suggest emotion. Containment suggests calculation. Athena does not punish Medusa further, but neither does she restore her. Restoration would undo the system. Punishment would be redundant. Containment is the only option that preserves order without confession. Athena becomes the custodian of unresolved violence, carrying it forward not as shame, but as infrastructure. In this way, Athena's shield becomes the final boundary in Medusa's story. It is not the boundary between life and death, nor between monster and hero, but between chaos and managed order. Medusa's power is no longer allowed to shape the world unpredictably. It is folded into the logic of war, strategy, and deterrence. Athena ensures that what was once an uncontrolled consequence now serves a controlled purpose. This second movement must be understood as the point where wisdom reveals its darkest aspect. Athena is not wiser because she is kinder. She is wiser because she knows how to make violence last without letting it spread. She understands that some wrongs cannot be undone, only managed, and so she chooses management over justice, containment over repair. The shield does not absolve the gods of what they did to Medusa. It ensures only that what they did will never threaten them again. The final truth of Athena's choice lies not in what she does with Medusa's head, but in what her action allows the divine system to avoid. By containing the head, rather than destroying it, Athena ensures that no reckoning ever occurs. The violation is never revisited, the weaponization is never questioned, the execution is never examined. Everything that led to Medusa's transformation is sealed beneath the surface of order and called wisdom. Athena's shield becomes the final layer of insulation between divine authority and the consequences of its own actions. This is why the act must not be mistaken for resolution. Resolution would require closure, and closure would require accountability. Athena offers neither. She offers permanence. By fixing Medusa's head onto her shield, she freezes the story at its most useful point. After the power has been extracted, but before the injustice that created it can demand explanation. The myth can now move forward unburdened, carrying the result without carrying the cause. Athena's wisdom is not the healing of wounds, but the stabilization of scars. In this final configuration, Medusa's identity is completely dissolved. She is no longer a woman, no longer even a monster. She is a device embedded in divine infrastructure. The gaze that once isolated her from the world is now deployed to protect the order that destroyed her. This inversion is not accidental. It is the ultimate achievement of the system. The victim's imposed power is repurposed to defend the authority that created the conditions of her suffering. Does not correct this inversion. She perfects it. The shield, now bearing Medusa's head, becomes a visible symbol of how power survives history. It does not erase what it has done. It displays the result in a way that reframes violence as necessity. The sight of the head is meant to inspire awe, fear, and obedience, not reflection. Those who see it are not invited to ask how Medusa came to be. They are meant to understand only that resistance ends here. In this sense, Athena's containment is not passive, it is pedagogical. It teaches the world what happens when divine order is challenged, without ever admitting that divine order was the first to violate its own laws. This is the final irony of Athena's role. She is the goddess of wisdom, yet the wisdom she embodies here is not moral insight, but strategic silence. She understands that myths endure not by telling the whole truth, but by telling a functional one. Medusa's head on the shield is the most functional ending imaginable. It closes the narrative without closing the wound. It preserves power without restoring dignity. It ensures obedience without justice. As this story ends, there is no catharsis. There is only structure intact. The gods remain unaccountable. The world remains governed. Medusa remains contained. Athena stands not as a redeemer, but as a custodian of unresolved violence. Her shield does not celebrate victory. It advertises stability purchased at the cost of truth. And that is where Medusa's story truly ends. Not with death, not with monstrosity, not even with power, but with management. The final lesson of this myth is not that order triumphs over chaos, but that order often survives by converting its own crimes into instruments of control and calling that conversion wisdom.